everyone. I hope you all are doing great. My name is Anjali and I am a STE2 at Microsoft. I'm also an educator. I usually teach data structures, algorithms, and system design. Today we are going to be discussing some most important interview questions from Java. So let's take a deep dive into it. Let's get started. So in this session, we are actually going to be helping you guys in understanding like how the interview setup is going to be there. If there is going to be any question, how are you going to be addressing it? So let's move to the next slide. So that particular one is how to answer any question in the interview. So you know what is actually going to happen? Like let us say, I'll just take a very simple example that I am giving you something like sort an array of zeros and ones. Now, we can actually have two things here. The first thing is you have understanding about arrays. The second one is array is completely a new topic. Like just understand it from that perspective. So if you don't understand this question, then what should be your approach for this question? And if you understand, then what should be your approach? So I'm actually going to be helping you out in both. So first of all, if you do not understand how to answer this question or any of the question, so instead of giving them a bad attitude, so in this case, one thing matters, that is if you are having a bad attitude or if you are having a good attitude. Now, how can we distinguish between the two? So, let us say you do not understand this question. In such a scenario, instead of giving up on this question, like instead of saying that, hey, I do not know this question, can you just provide me some other question? So, that particular thing will go into bad attitude. And you know why bad attitude? Because tomorrow, whenever you are going to be working for any of the company, not necessary that all the time you will be getting only those questions in which you have a good grip. Most of the times we will be getting some challenging situations, and for those challenging situations you should be prepared enough. If you will give up even in the interview, people will understand that tomorrow when you will be onboarded, whenever you will be having any such requirement, instead of putting your 100%, you may give up. So that is something which will turn into a bad attitude there. The second one which we have here is good attitude. So good attitude means if you have this question, even if you do not understand it, instead of giving up, you should say, hey, can you please help me out in having a better understanding across it? So, you know what those guys are going to do? The interview panel, they will help you out either by explaining you the question itself or by explaining you some test case, some pointers they are going to give you. And after that, probably you will end up getting some insights about it and you may be able to answer to this question. But let's consider another scenario that even after taking their help, you are not able to solve it. Then what you should do? Then also, you are actually having chances of getting selected because you're already exhibiting your quality that you are more focused about learning. So instead of giving up, you are putting your efforts in understanding a question. And always these things will go in your favor. So always try to have a good attitude in your interview even if you do not understand the question. Okay, the second one which we have here is, what if you understood what the question is? Then what should be your approach? So I have seen a lot of guys who directly jump into implementation of the question, and that is a very bad approach. Why? Because let us just consider your scenario that let us say you are quite interested, or you can say like you are quite into competitive programming or anything, and just like you want to showcase that in your interview, but you need to understand one more thing, that your interview is maximum going to be of 40 to 60 minutes. You have this 45 to 60 minutes of time when you can actually tell the other person about whatever you know. So instead of taking that interview in a bad direction, you should actually utilize this time period by making most out of it. Now, how can you make most out of it? So let us say you understood this question. Instead of directly jumping into implementation, you should first ask that this is my understanding, this is how I am going to proceed, is it correct or not? So asking questions at each and every level is very important. There is one thing which you should be always there, that is communication. And when you talk about communication, it doesn't mean that you are going to chit chat with the interview panel. But by the communication, we mean we are just interacting with that person and we are getting validated for our thought process. If they will approve, then you move ahead. Or let us say you have this sort an array of zeros and one question with you. Whatever questions, whatever like solutions you have in your mind, like let us say for this you already know the brute force, you already know the best approach. So what you should do, instead of implementing the brute force, you explain it to the panel that for this one, this is the brute force, but I am not going to do it because this one takes more time complexity or more space complexity or both. And then you should say that now I'm going to go ahead with the another approach in which we are going to be optimizing our solution, and by optimizing we are getting this time complexity or that space complexity. So if you will be answering in that manner, the chances of you getting selected is going to be higher. So always interact with that person, whatever is there in your mind, even if it is like, let us say for this question, even if you are having a thought which may be stupid, but still you deliver it, because in that case what will happen, sometimes the panel is going to help you out by questioning you that time itself. Or even if it is not going in the right direction, at least the person will understand that you have a wider thought process. Like I said, you just have 45 to 60 minutes. In that time, you just have to make most out of it. So whatever knowledge you have, like of course, do not put a lot of information there, but at least put all the relevant one. And when you are going to do it in that manner, of course you are going to stand out in the crowd, because you need to understand for any job position we have plenty of job applications, and every person in today's time is equally like qualified. Everybody is just putting a lot of efforts in the competitive programming and everything. So after having that net tight competition, if you really want to stand out in the crowd, this is how you can actually leverage your skills, and that is how you can actually make most out of it. Now let's move to the next slide. Now, the next important question is what should I know? And it is going to be applicable for everyone who is actually viewing this video, be it a fresher or a working professional. So the question is, what should I do? What should I know to get into these big companies? So I will try to categorize it into three sections. So the first section is going to be less than 2 years of experience, which is going to be for the freshers. The second one is going to be between 2 to 7 years of experience, and then we will have another one which is experience more than 7 years. Okay, and whatever I'm telling you, this is according to the global standards. Less than 2 years for the freshers, 2 to 7 years, and lastly we will have more than 7 years. Now for this particular one, of course you must be knowing that we will be needing two major skills for any of your job. The first one goes into your competitive programming, which you can say coding, and the second one will go into system design. So whenever you will be giving any interview, in that particular case, these are the two things which is going to be required. And trust me, this is the most commonly asked questions which everybody is going to be asking these days, because they are quite confused that if you are preparing for something, what should be your approach. So even if whenever you will be giving interviews, at that particular time you will be actually having two different kinds of interview rounds. The first one will be across your coding skills, second one will be across your design skills. So when here you will be talking about less than 2 years, so what is actually expected in this case. 70% coding skills and 30% design skills. When you talk about 2 to 7 years, in such a case, what is actually expected, that you have 50% coding skills and you have 50% design skills. And when you talk about more than 7 years of experience, so when you are talking about more than 7 years of experience, that can be either for the individual contributor role, or it can be even for the managerial role, because they are also engineering manager. So there also people are going to be asking you questions across your coding skills and design skills. So for that particular case, you should be knowing 30% coding, you can say 30% coding skills, and 70% should be your design skills. And whatever I have explained you here, you need to keep this in your mind. This is according to the global standards. So that now you will be knowing if you are actually having any of, like if you are having your experience in any of these categories, how you should be continuing ahead with your preparation, because a lot of people don't even know what to prepare and how to prepare. If you will be knowing these things, at least it will be better for you. Also, you need to keep one thing in your mind, that any of the great companies of this world, if you will go and look into this, is going to be actually asking you for less than 2 years of experience, they will be asking you for 70%, like they will be judging you on your coding skills, like are you even able to write down the code or not, and 30% they will judge you on the system design round. And if you will see, like I have seen a lot of people saying that for the fresher it is not required, but you need to understand one more thing, the competition is too steep in the market. Just with the 70% of the coding skills, you will be able to qualify the interview, but you need to understand 30% is also very important. But for that, what is most important thing, that you should be knowing design as well as coding. So what actually happens whenever you will be joining any of the company, they will just be focusing upon that if a fresher is there, if he or she is able to write down the code or not. They just test that are you even going to be the best fit in the company or not. So that is what is required. On the top of that, people are also expecting freshers also to be little involved in the coding, in the designing part. And when you talk about the designing part, like let us say you're creating a class, you should be knowing which class to create where, what should be the access modifier, what kind of design pattern principle, whatever you want to apply there. And you should be prepared for that, because you must be knowing we are having a cutthroat competition. So if you want to go into the best companies, you need to prepare for both of the things. Now when you will be focusing upon 2 to 7 years of the experience, typically what I have realized, that why it is actually going to be 50-50, because I will actually tell you one good point that I would like to mention here, is that you should not be focusing on one specific technology. No good company will ask you what is Express, what is Spring Boot. No company will ask you such questions. What company will ask you is that how you are going to solve this problem, and that problem is majorly comprising of on data structures and algorithm. They will ask you problems only in coding. They will ask you these questions on designing the system. Nobody will ask you that explain me how the MERN stack works. Nobody will ask you how a typical technology works, because technology changes, and change is the only constant. And whenever you talk about the software world, right, whether it is you or me, whether a language like C++, whether a technology like Angular, this IT world is so rude. Whether a software engineer knows a language or a technology, it does not matter. If you are not upgrading themselves, then the IT ecosystem throw them away. And it is true for the software engineer, true for any language, true for any technology. So you will figure out for those languages which are not upgraded themselves, which have not changed themselves with the changing time, people have stopped using them. So those technologies which are not relevant, typically people have thrown them away. And same is true even for a software engineer. If you will not upgrade, if you will be not up to date with the technology, in such a case it will become difficult. So, experience does not matter, unfortunately, in the IT industry. If you will go to the mechanical field or civil field, there with your experience, you will be more respected. But unfortunately, in the world of software development, if you will not have the updated skills, if you will not have the latest knowledge, in such a case, it is actually going to become little difficult for you to survive in the IT industry. So always upgrade yourself. And whenever it is about the interview rounds in these big tech giants, always focus upon both data structures, algorithms, along with that system design. And this is the approach which you should be following. Now let's move to the next slide. So that is access modifiers in Java. So, even though it seems to be a very easy thing, but I'll have seen people will ask you questions here. So, what and all are the access modifiers in the Java? First, let me list it down. So, the first one which we have is public. The second one which we have is protected. Third one, default. And lastly, we have private. So, whenever you will have to reply to these things, like, how your approach should be. Like, let us say, I'm asking you what is a public access modifier. So, instead of giving me that typical definition or that typical explanation, your approach should be start always with a real life example. If I'm asking you public, probably you can give me examples of something like public park, public transport. Based upon that, you can build up the understanding across the public access modifier. And then probably you can say that if it is public, it is going to be available always, like at all the places. Similarly, if you talk about protected, so you can say who is very protected. Our parents are protected. So whenever you have a parent-child relationship, that is where this protected access modifier is going to be coming into the picture. Then you have default. So for the default, you can just say it is going to be internal. For the example purpose, probably you can give a society park is going to be available for all the apartments in the society. And for the protected, probably you can say if a child is going to their parents' house, they can access the park in their parents' house or something like that. And lastly, we have private. So when you talk about private, example can be a private event, private function. So not other people are going to be there, only the closed knit people are going to be there. And in this case, it is going to be that class itself. So if you will be giving explanation in that manner, people are going to gain some insights. And how it is actually asked in the interview, of course, nobody is going to ask you directly what is public and all, unless you are a fresher. If you are a fresher, people may ask you. If you are having more years of experience, what they will do, they are going to provide you some code snippet. After having that code snippet, they will ask you questions like, tell me, will it throw any error or not? Because when you see that piece of code on your screens, on some IDE, it is easier for you to figure out the errors or something. But if you will be seeing that piece of code on a printed format, either on a piece of paper or digitally, in such a case, it will become difficult. So how quickly you are able to understand the access. Plus, sometimes they will say that if a parent class is having this variable or this function, we want to use it in the child, how we will be able to achieve it. So these questions, even though it may sound easier, but in the interview, because what happens whenever you will be giving some interview, you will be having some anxiety. You will be having some stress for that interview. And in that, even if it is some simpler one, we may fumble up. We may give wrong answers. We may get confused. At the same time, if you have seen, some interview panels are more focused upon challenging you by putting a pressure on your head that, are you sure it is going to be like this? Are you sure it is going to be like that? So, in such a scenarios, you should not get confused and be confident. And how can you be confident? Whenever you are learning something, at that particular time, always learn it like you have to deliver it to a larger audience. Then only you will be able to understand all those topics end to end. If you are not doing it in that approach, of course, in such a case, you may miss out on lot of points. And in the interviews, when people will cross question you on your explanation, you may give wrong answers. So be clear in your head. I have seen people even arguing on access modifiers, also on time complexity. But you be clear with whatever you are speaking that it is correct and it is not going in the wrong direction. And across all these access modifiers, like, there is another set of questions which come into the picture, which is related to your object oriented programming. So there in the encapsulation, people will ask you, like, if you want to for from the oops perspective, how the questions can come. They will say, okay, tell me about encapsulation, or they will say, write down a code on encapsulation. So usually what people will say, encapsulation is wrapping up of fields and members. But whenever it is about encapsulation, there is one thing which you should always keep it in your mind. Whenever you are working on encapsulation, the two things you should always focus, that is, all your fields should be private and all your methods are going to be public. And when you talk about private fields, it is basically like locking the fields so that nobody else can come and modify it. And how can you perform that lock? That is all possible with the help of access modifiers. Okay. And of course, here I'm just saying private fields. It is, you can better say locked fields, and how you are going to unlock them with the help of these access modifiers. Now let's move to the next slide. The next one which we have here is constructors and its types. So, people will be asking you, what is a constructor? So why do we use a constructor? Like, example is going to be, whenever you start using any phone, any laptop, any electronic device, it is pre-configured to some default settings. Similar thing, if you want to achieve it in your code, how can you do it? With the help of constructors. And in order to achieve that, we have these 4 constructors. So what is a default constructor? It is also called as parameterless constructor. And whenever you will be talking about a constructor, whatever the class name is there, constructor is also going to have the same name. Plus, for that constructor, there is not going to be any return type. So let us say we have a class A. Inside that, we will be having public A. So this is nothing but your parameterless constructor, because here we are not passing any parameters. And why do we use parameter constructor? Like, let us say you have to do some work. By default, you want to put some values, and those values are not going to be specific. Like, I'll give you example of this phone only. So let us say you are buying a phone. By default it will have some ringtone. By default it will have some brightness level. Even if you are buying one phone or 1,000 phones, it is going to be standard in all of those phones. So how can you set, since those settings are specific to all the phones irrespective of anything, all of that you can probably put it in your default constructor. Now the next one which we have here is parameterized constructor. So when you talk about parameterized constructor, in this case, you are going to be providing some parameters, and based upon those parameters, we are going to be initializing it. Like, let us say we are providing some parameter here, and based upon this parameter, now we are going to be performing some initialization. So if you want to achieve that, you are going to be using parameterized constructors for that. Like, I'll give you example of phone again. So let us say you have a phone, and by default, let us say it had a wallpaper of mountains. Now you want to set a picture of tree there. So when you will restart your phone, you do not want it to load the mountain wallpaper. You want it to load the tree wallpaper. So how can you perform that? By providing that parameter here. If you will follow this approach, then it will work in that manner. So you should be knowing when to use parameterized constructor whenever you have to initialize something based upon the parameters given. And of course, here you are providing the parameters. It will vary from objects to objects. It's not going to be constant throughout. Like I was giving you for the default, it is like one phone, 1,000 phones, any number of phones. If a company is producing some model number, it is going to have all the same settings in all those phones. But when you talk about parameterized, like let us say you have that phone, some Samsung phone of some model, your sibling also has. Now you both can actually have different settings, right? So you both have given it parameters according to your own need. So that is how your parameterized constructor comes into the picture. Now the next one which we have here is copy constructor. So you know how typically any question can come. People will ask you what is a constructor and what are its types. So you will just list them, all the different constructors. Then they will ask you, is it possible to, like when you will be telling them about parameterized constructor, so they will ask you what and all different parameters you can give. So you can give something like integer, string, boolean. Then they may ask you questions like, is it possible to pass the constructor itself as a parameter? So if you will see, even though that is the explanation for the copy constructor, but sometimes because of that interview pressure, we may end up getting confused. So you do not have to get confused when you talk about copy constructor. In such a case, it is possible to pass a constructor as a parameter. And why we perform it? In order to perform copy. And why do we need copy? A lot of times, even in our real lives, we need to just copy the things. So if you have notes, you can just make a copy digitally. If it is printed, you can get a photostat. So that is how you can perform copy of the items available to you. The next one which we have is your private constructor. So when you talk about private constructor, right, why do we use it? So this is very important. And in this case, basically we use it for your singleton design pattern. So in this case, what we are going to do, instead of making it as public, we are going to make it as private. And what is going to be the reason for making it as private? Because when it is public, you can create more than one object. But you know what singleton design pattern says? It say that if you are having more than one objects of your class, so instead of having like, you know, like let us say you are having objects like A, this is object B, this is object C. It say that instead of having 3 different objects, I want one singleton object. And now this singleton object will go ahead and perform the task. That is what singleton says. So in that case, we will keep it as private. Now if it is private, how are you going to access it? So for this, for the singleton design pattern, you should make your constructor private. You should provide a private field. And what this private field will do, this one is going to return you the instance of this private constructor. And like when I was discussing about encapsulation, I told you, right, private fields, public methods. So this is also private, this is also private. We need something to expose it to the outside world. So in order to achieve that, we are going to be using a public method. And with the help of this, anyone from the outside can come and access it. So that is where your private constructor is going to be coming into the picture. There is one more thing that is called as static block. So in other languages, we may refer it as static constructor. In Java, we refer it as static block. Now, what is a static block? So, you know, people will ask you that, okay, in my code, I have a copy constructor, I have a default constructor, and I have a static block. So tell me which one will get executed first. So, you know, always static block will get executed first. So if anybody is going to ask you any questions, so firstly, your static block will get executed. After that, your default. And post that, all other Because of course for the parameterized and copy we will be needing some parameters, but for these two we do not need any parameters. Also, one more thing which you should keep it in your mind, like this is how you will be defining your static block. And for the default you already know that is how we will be doing. So if you have to execute, this one will get priority over this, so this will get executed first. One thing, this will get executed only one time. On the other side, this will get executed more than one. What do I mean? Like if I have a class A, and for that class A I am creating objects like this. So in this case, if you will see what we are doing, we are creating two objects of this class A. When you will be executing this, firstly your static block will get executed. After static block, your default will get executed. And when you will be executing this one, like I said, static will get executed only once, so static will not get executed again, just default will get executed. So people may ask you what is the order in which the constructors will get called. So you should be actually clear with these terms. Now let's move to the next slide. Now the next one which we have here is constructor versus destructor in Java. So when you talk about constructors and destructors, what is a constructor? So like the name says, construct. So what it will be doing, it is going to be constructing a variable. And when you talk about constructing, what do we actually mean? It is going to be initializing a variable. And whenever we have to initialize a variable, how can we achieve it? By allocating a memory. Like even if like let us say some employee is actually giving some job interview, so before that the company must have defined a place or a budget for that employee. Similarly, if you want to initialize a variable, we will have to allocate some memory for it. Then the next one which we have here is destructor. So why do we use destructor? That whatever memory you have whatever memory you have allocated here at the time of initialization, you are going to be freeing up that memory. So free memory allocated during initialization. Okay, so when you talk about constructor, in this case whenever you talk about default constructor, right, so it will get invoked on its own. You do not have to call it separately. So what is a constructor? That is nothing but automatic initialization of the object. So whenever the program is going to be creating an object, that particular time your constructor will get called automatically and it will keep on allocating the memory. On the other side, when you talk about destructor, so what it will do, it is going to be freeing up the space whatever you allocated at a time of initialization. But when you talk about Java, so generally we do not need to call the destructor explicitly. Java has a feature of automatic garbage collector. So you do not have to call it separately. It will get called on its own. So some of the times we actually perform some garbage collection separately, and that is where if some memory which is not getting released on its own, for that part we need to run garbage collector separately, but it for most of the things it will keep on doing on its own. So that is why we will be needing a constructor and a destructor. Okay, now let's move to the next slide. The next one is how does memory allocation and deallocation work in Java. So basically we will be needing constructor and destructor. So why we use it? So that we can handle memory allocation and memory deallocation effectively. So for the memory allocation, we need constructor. For memory deallocation, we will be needing destructors. Okay, and this one is very important because whenever you will be talking, not just in this programming language, in all of the programming languages, because everywhere we will have a need of initializing and destroying that variable after its work is done. So if you have to destroy it, you are going to be freeing up that memory space. So that is where your memory allocation comes into the picture, that once the work is done, just free up the memory location. And when you have to start doing some work, you just have to initialize some variables. So that is how your memory allocation and deallocation works. So you know how it is actually going to be working. You know that whenever you talk about constructor, so constructor is nothing but just a method in the Java, and it will have the same name as your class name. Also, when you talk about constructor, it will not have any return type. I have already shown you the example for the constructor. So the time you are going to be instantiating any class, at that time itself, it is going to initialize the object. And in that case, we are basically going to be allocating some memory to all the variables, whatever we are using inside that constructor. And for the destructor part, like I said, you do not actually have to do it separately. It will actually work on its own, but still somehow if you want to handle it, so how can you do it? With the help of finalize methods. So when you talk about finalize methods, like of course we are going to be discussing about this more in detail when we will be learning about garbage collector. So we use finalize method, and we even have dispose methods for the same. So when we will be discussing about garbage collection, then I will be discussing more about it in detail. Okay, now let's move to the next slide. Now we are going to be discussing about static keyword. So this static keyword is one of the most commonly asked interview question, and people will be asking you what is static, where and all you can use it. So this static keyword, you can use it at 4 places. First one is static variable, then we have a static method, static block, and a static class. And this static class, people also refer it as nested class. Now we are going to be discussing what is a static keyword and why do we use it. So this static keyword is majorly used for the memory management. And why are we saying about memory management? Because in this case, we just want to create one copy throughout. So now the first one which we have here is static variable. So whenever we will be using a static keyword next to a variable, at that particular time we will say that it is becoming a static variable. And when you talk about a static variable, right, so it will get memory only once in the class area at the time of class loading, because like I said, it will maintain one copy throughout. So when you talk about one copy throughout, it means just allocate memory only once. So like what is the actual advantage of using static variable? So the major advantage is it will make your program memory efficient. And when you talk about memory efficient, what does it mean? It is going to be saving the memory. That is why we are saying it will get allocated only once. Post that we will not have the, like post that we are not going to be allocating memory separately. And let us say we have a class A. Inside this class A, we have a variable. Let us say something like public static int 5. And then you have public static void main. Inside that, if you want to use this, So you know how you can actually access class name dot variable name. You do not actually have to instantiate and then use it here. You can directly use it with the class name, and that is what is the major purpose of a static, that if you want to access it, you do not have the need to instantiating it. You can just directly call it directly. Okay. Now we will discuss about your static method. So you know, when you talk about static method, in that case, what we actually say, you will have to put a static keyword with any of your method, and then it will become your static method. And when you talk about a static method, right, so that will belong to the class rather than object of the class. So the same way how you were calling a static variable, similar manner you can even call a static method just by the class name. So a dot, like whatever the class name, dot method name. Also, you know what we can say about it, that if it is a static method, so it can be invoked without the need for creating an instance of the class. You do not have to create instance, and you can call it directly by the class name dot method name. And when you talk about the static method, right, so it can access static data members, and it can even change the value of it. Like if you have a class A, inside that you have public static print, public void print. Now if you want to call this method inside your public static void main, so you know you can just do a dot print and it will get called on its own. You do not actually have to instantiate. So that way what we can say, it is getting instantiated without, it is getting called instead of instantiating. But you know, here also we have some restrictions, and what are those? Inside this static method, you cannot use this and super keyword. Also, when you talk about the static method, right, so this static method cannot use non-static data member. And what is a non-static data member? A static variable is something with a static like just now we saw some static int or something, and just how you define, like let us say int b. So this is your static member, this is your non-static. So when you talk about a static method, so it will not use non-static data member, or it will not call non-static method directly. So that is the limitation. Okay. Also, this one gives rise to one more question, and what is that? So the question is, you guys must have known about your main method. So the people will ask you questions like, why Java main method static? So you know why they have actually made it static? Because whatever, like you must be knowing, why do we use main method? You can say it is a entry point for your program to start the execution. So, you know, if it is the entry point, if you will put a limitation that I will call it only with the object, then it will not be an effective manner of calling it. That is why we are making it as static, because object is not required to call a static method. If it was a non-static method, your Java virtual machine will create an object first and then it will call the main method. And that will lead to the problem of extra memory allocation. In order to avoid that extra memory allocation, we are going to be making it as static. So I hope by this it must be clear to you. So we can say, to avoid extra memory allocation. Now the next one which we have is static block. So I already discussed about the static block. How can you define it? Just you have to use static and then you just put your code inside that. And you need to understand one more thing. If you are defining it like this, what is going to be the advantage? It will get invoked only once, and we usually put that kind of a code inside it which we need to run only once. Like let us say opening a file, you do not want every object to open a file. If you need some file, you can just open it once with by putting that code inside the static block. Also, if you have some static variables, if you want to instantiate them, if you want to initialize them, you can just do that in the static block, because that also we will be doing only once. Now, there is one more thing, that is your static class. So what is a static class? Like here I have mentioned, it is going to be your nested class. So here what will actually happen, you will be using some nested class. And why are we doing it in that manner? So outside we will have some outer class. Let me actually erase and then write. So then outside you will have some outer class, inside that you will have some inner class, and then you will have some static class. That is how you will be having your hierarchy. Now, why are we having it in this manner? That is because you cannot instantiate your static class directly. So if you will make your outer class static, you cannot reach to the inner class directly. That is why always make your outer class non-static, and by outer class you can go ahead and reach to your static class. And since if you will see, this is a class inside another class, that is why we are referring it as nested. So these are the two different classes with their own class definition. Now let's move to the next topic, and that is the last topic for our today's day, and that particular one is super keyword. So when you talk about this super keyword, again it's one of the interview question. People will ask you questions on what a super keyword, how to use it. So this super keyword, you can actually use it with three things: variable, method, constructor. Now you know where and all to use it, but the question is why to use it. So whenever you will be performing inheritance, let us say you are having a parent class. Inside that you have a variable, something like int roll number or anything, okay? And let us say now you are having a child class, and child class is using parent class. I'm writing the pseudocode, so don't go typically on how I'm writing, just understand, okay? So here I'm again using int roll number, and here I'm having value 10. Now if you want to use it from your main method, so if you are creating object of your child class, it will always return you the value 10. There is no way you can actually call this one. But if you want to call this one, either in the main method or here, so how can you achieve it? By using super. So if you want to access that, you will use super dot variable name, and that is how you will have access to this value 5 as well, and it will not get lost. So that is how your super will work with a variable. I hope you guys must have understood. Okay. Now, similar manner, when you talk about a similar manner when you talk about a method, right? So let us say here we have a function like print, and here also we have a function print. Now if you want to call, so every time this print, like if you are creating object of the parent class, then only this will get called. If you are creating object of this one, this print will get called. But what if I want to use this one here? So how can I achieve it? By using super. So you will use super dot print, and the super dot print will call the parent class print method. The last one which we have here is a constructor. So what is a super constructor? So I'll just give you different scenarios here. Let us say you are having a parent method. Now for this parent method, it can have two kinds of parameters. It can have a default, it can have parameterized, or it can have, just consider both. Like if I'm talking about default, it means along with default it can have other. When I'm talking about parameterized, so with parameterized you do not have default. That way it is there. And similarly here also it can have default and parameterized. These are the two scenarios. Now, when you talk about this default, let us say they both have only default method. Then, even if you're having some constructor here, it will work perfectly fine because they both are default. They don't need any parameter. So it will work perfectly fine. You do not have to worry. Even it is not going to give you any error. So the moment you will create object of your child class, it will invoke your child class constructor and parent class constructor. What if your child class is having a parameterized constructor and your parent is having default? Then also it will work fine. You know when it is going to create problem? When they both are parameterized or when the parent class constructor is parameterized. In such a case, it will give you error. And why? Because of course, if it is parameterized, so it is expecting some parameter. So how can you provide the parameter? With the help of super keyword. So in the child class, you will be using super, and with the help of super, let us say here it is asking for some variable names, string name. So you will be providing some name here, and this super will pass this parameter here to the parent class constructor. So that is how your super keyword will be working with a constructor. And this is again very important question because people will not ask you direct questions, but they will say, okay, we have a class, we have another class, they are performing inheritance. Now if you want to initialize this, how in this class constructor, how you will be able to do it. So questions are always going to be simpler, but you need to figure out the answer with your deeper understanding. So I hope I was able to help you guys in gaining the insights about the Java interview. If yes, then do like the video. If you have not yet subscribed to the Talent500 YouTube channel, then do subscribe and share this video with your friends. And whatever doubts, whatever questions you have, please post them in the comment section below and we will be happy to answer them. And I will be seeing you in the next video. Till then, happy learning guys. Bye bye. Stay connected.